Hey Julia, welcome back. We're going to try week
Hello.
2 of our Medicaid data chat together. How are you?
I'm great. I'm so excited. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. We're going to pick up the program integrity topic, which has been big in the news, and it's a really interesting data topic. So that's the lens we're going to dig into today. Like program integrity in data in Medicaid, which I have to say I'm pretty psyched to dig into. It's a pretty nerdy topic. So, um, Julie, what's interesting to me about this topic is that there has been a tremendous amount of program integrity work in Medicare, but actually much less in Medicaid. And just like putting on the data perspective, like why is that? Why have we seen so much less program integrity work in Medicaid? And what's the relevance of that as we start thinking about like a lot more scrutiny coming down, in terms of looking at these data sets?
So, part of the reason why we have seen so much more Medicare related program integrity work is because, and I will say this from the perspective of CMS. When I say this, I'm talking about the CMS perspective. CMS is directly implementing traditional Medicare. And so the way in which they are getting their data, they have data that providers are submitting directly to them, and then they can use that data to see if things are happening the way that they should be happening. And although Medicare Advantage kind of has one intermediary, providers are submitting to plans, plans are submitting to Medicare. The rules are pretty simple. They're much more consistent across those two programs. On the Medicaid side of the house, it is much, much messier. So every single state is running its own program. There are 56 separate programs. When you have a provider that is billing to Medicaid, they are first billing either to a state or they're billing to a managed care plan. The state is the one that is paying for those services. And so the data that they're getting, they are kind of the ones that are the first step for operationalizing that program integrity. So they are doing a lot of program integrity work. But then the states are taking those data, either that are getting reported from the providers or from the managed care plans, and they are reporting it to CMS. And so from CMS's perspective, they have pretty messy data. And so to be able to really do program integrity work, you have to both know what is supposed to be happening in the program and then if it is actually happening. And from CMS's perspective, you have 56 different programs. All of them have very, very different rules as to what is supposed to be happening. And then they're getting these data that are varying different levels from states, reflecting providers, reflecting managed care plans. So it's a much messier scene. And so looking at program integrity has been much harder historically.
Yeah. And I think this compounds over time, just to state the obvious, because when you start looking into a data set, its quality tends to improve. People know that you're looking at it. You develop all sorts of interesting algorithms, right, to dig in and look at the data. And I think it's probably fair to say that's an extension of this too, right? Like not only is the data more complex, but where you have a long history of investigating a data set from a program integrity perspective, you build methods of doing that. And that's not to say there aren't methods in Medicaid, right? But a lot of the concepts that we might have built to evaluate in Medicare data sets, right, I would say arguably are like less mature on the Medicaid side. Is that fair?
Yes, I think that's exactly right. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I would love to talk a bit about TAMSIS. We talk about TAMSIS all the time. And yet it's still not used as heavily as other data sets for a lot of the reasons that you described. And so I want to level on that because when we think about program integrity at the federal level, TAMSIS is a predominant data set, right? And
Yeah.
yet this is not a system that most states are using actively and regularly in the course of their operations. It's a reporting data set. And so I think it's really important to understand, like, if you're sitting in a state, you're sitting in a managed care plan, well, what data is actually being used by the federal government? And there are other data sets, but TMSIS is a really important data set. So maybe I want to clarify Mathematica's role in this. We did not create TMSIS. It was, created by a different company, and yet we have spent a lot of time in this data set. So Julie, can you tell us a little bit about like what is TMSIS, right? Like this big overset data that sits behind the scenes that everyone's using, like what is it and why is it relevant in the context of program integrity?
Yes. So TMSIS is the Transformed Medicaid Statistical Information System. So it is the newer version of the Medicaid Statistical Information System. So it has been around in some form for many, many, many years. It was designed about 15 years ago, which was a time in which Medicaid looked very, very different. So we have seen since it was designed, there are a lot more programs. We are using value-based care. So there are all of these things that are not reflected in the initial design that you might want to have those data to be able to represent today. That said, so what it is it is the data that states are reporting to Medicaid. It reflects enrollment, claims, managed care organizations, providers, and third-party liability. And so states are responsible for reporting it. They are getting their data from providers directly and managed care plans, as I mentioned. They are doing a ton of transformation to get the data that they have into this uniform data system, so TMSIS. So there is this kind of making the data uniform and consistent in a way that can be read in on the federal side. But what that tends to mean is that the way in which they are using their own data looks different in that transformation. And so managed care plans, as an example, don't necessarily have insight into all of that transforming that the state does. And so what CMS is using could look very different than what a managed care organization is actually reporting directly to a state, and then what that state ends up reporting to CMS. So CMS takes those data, they use it for a variety of different purposes, and it is reflecting who is being served, the services that they're getting, and the delivery system in which they are receiving those services.
Yeah. So I think the important point here, right, is like the gap between the time that this data is collected, and not just the time, but like, how it's collected, the format it's collected in, the systems it's collected in, and then when and how it's ultimately used for oversight is pretty wide relative to other data sets that might be used for oversight. Like there's a lot of transformations happening in the middle. There's a lot of players. And so if you're a submitter or you're someone being evaluated, it's really important to know, like, this is a very important data set, and it probably feels pretty far from like the data that you're looking at on a day-to-day basis, unless you're a state or a managed care plan that is actively using this data set for some other purpose, which there are some that are, but it's pretty far away, right, by the time it gets through that. I think the other thing is because it's, because we have had less scrutiny on the data set, it tends to be out of sight, out of mind. And so I want to talk about this for a second, because data quality work is hard. So
Yeah.
a data set can be important, and it's going to be very expensive for your organization to invest in and do that work. And so, I think there's been this historical pattern where whenever CMS has created some sort of oversight or scrutiny and shown a light on something, the data improves, but it doesn't tend to go the other way, right? Because like, who has the resources to be like, hey, I'm just going to like pick up this data set and like clean up and improve it. It happens sometimes if there's another purpose. But Julia, can you talk about this a little bit? Because I think the very act of CMS digging in on program integrity and Medicaid is also very likely to have the dual effect of having folks start to pay attention to the underlying data to improve it. So are there precedents for this? Like, can you tease this out a little bit, where there has been scrutiny and the data has correspondingly sort of caught up, right? And that gap that we're talking about has closed?
Yes, absolutely. And I think one thing to say is Mathematica has been very deeply involved in supporting CMS and improving the quality of the TMSIS data. And so we have seen a ton of improvement since states began submitting TMSIS. A part of that, I think, has been because CMS has put a lot of support into identifying what they have called originally they were top priority issues. So they looked at the TMSIS data. There are thousands of data quality measures that CMS looked at. And so they picked several top priority issues. They looked at and produced a map, and they showed each state and where they landed in terms of those issues. And then they worked with states to improve them. And so they saw over the course of many years, those issues got so much better. Then they came up with another version of it. They got their next wave of top priority issues. Then they changed kind of how they were prioritizing. They're using a different system now, but we've seen that the quality of the data has moved so dramatically. And a part of that has just been that this was just using a map and showing states that have better or worse data quality. And that was enough to get states to move the needle. So that's one example. We've also seen several places in which we're using the data for monitoring purposes, where we have started using it, publishing publicly. Here is what is going on. One example is during COVID, we did a bunch of monitoring with CMS to look and see how is this program responding. And part of that was we had an overlay and we said, here are the states where the data are not sufficient to report this. And states worked with us and they said, why? What are the measures? What we want to be able to report this. And so we saw in those measures specifically as well that they kind of made a bunch of improvements too. So to your point, when you use it and when you present it, there are these opportunities to really be able to go in and make those improvements.
Right. So I think for me, just to name it, right, like this is an important, whenever you start to shine a light on a program, like you can expect this trend of like really everyone's suddenly scrutinizing this data and saying, what are we looking at, right? And which gets to the last topic I want to raise. We said we're going to do these in 5 minutes. That's probably never going to be true. We can celebrate it when it does happen. But our last topic for today, right, is just to talk about like the noise that happens in this data. Like, so we care a lot about data quality. And it's really interesting because sometimes data quality issues, right, can masquerade as program integrity issues. And it's like far more common in the early phase of a program integrity initiative than it might be like in a later phase because of this gap, right, in data sets, right? And I think we would very much expect to see this in TMSIS, knowing that some aspects of the data set have been highly scrutinized, highly improved, and other aspects of the data set haven't. This is a huge data set when we're talking about covering like 56 states and territories. So give me an example of like the kind of noise, right, that you would expect to see where you would look at it and you would say, hey, like this could be data quality, it could be fraud, waste, and abuse. Like how does that show up in a data set?
So one example, oftentimes we are trying to identify providers who may be problematic. How do you identify a problematic provider? So the first thing that you would want to look at when you're using the data is a provider identifier. And so you would then potentially want to look at, okay, let me look at expenditures by provider and just see if there are any outliers. Is there anybody who is billing kind of an unexpected number? They're getting a lot of payment. Like that's kind of a first clue that something might not be up to snuff. And provider identifiers have historically not always been accurately reported. And so there's one state that has more than 80% of their national provider identifiers are missing. And so if you don't know that and you look and you see, okay, I see this one provider, their expenditures are so much higher relative to everybody else, it might look like a program integrity issue. But if you really dig in and you see, oh, 80% of the provider identifiers are missing, if I had all of the other data, I would see that they're in line. So that is kind of one example. And you didn't ask about this, but going one step a little bit further, there's also a lot of nuance in that variable. And so part of it is also just understanding what is in there. So you might also see for that variable that it includes individual providers and it also includes group providers. So you might see that I billed personally as a provider for this set of services. But in that same variable, you might see that Johns Hopkins in Maryland and all of their hospitals have the same identifier. And so if you were to just look blanket at national provider identifiers, you might see, oh my gosh, this one set of numbers is outrageously high when you compare to me and to any other individual level provider. And what it might be reflecting is that it's every single Johns Hopkins hospital. And so there's a nuance that's not necessarily a data quality issue, but a contextual issue of kind of what is included in that variable that you really need in order to really understand, is there a program integrity issue or isn't there?
Yeah, this is such an important point, right? Like if we were to go back 15 years and redesign TMSIS, like some of this ambiguity could be cleaned up in the structure of TMSIS, right? Like it's by no means a perfect data set, right? And some of it is just also how it's being reported from states, right? It's context, like so much matters in the context of Medicaid. And or just simply like this is a data set that folks haven't been scrutinizing, and so they haven't really clicked in to say, hey, like what's coming through in this field. So there's tons of examples of this, right? That I think like we would expect there to be like a wave of, oh my gosh, what's happening here? You're digging into these programs, like we've got to really look at this data set. We really have to figure out what's happening, right? And then some of that will naturally get cleaned up, right, over time. Like as there's more scrutiny on the data set, some of it will improve.
I think that's exactly right.
Yeah. Julia, it's so nice to talk to you. I think we might continue with program integrity part 2 next week. No promises, but there's more to talk about here. So nice to see you. We'll
You
talk
too.
again soon.
Take care. Bye.